Hello and welcome to Gar Borras' Time Machine. This is episode 44, and Gar, today we're going all the way back to episode 1, which during that conversation, which was on the 90th anniversary of Dracula, you had shared with us that one of your all-time favorite movies is the classic 1933 horror film King Kong. So let's get right into it. Why is that film so special? Why does it have such special memories for you?
Well, the trippy thing is, for me, when I watched it as a kid, I would imagine it was back in the 60s, when that was a time period for me at that time, and it was. It's hard to describe because, we've had so many movies now where it's like commonplace. It's like no big deal. Everybody's used to it and everything. But back in the 1960s, it wasn't like that. That movie, was so bigger than life. And I didn't know it at the time. I just gravitated towards it because it was so well done for 1933.
Yeah. Now let me ask you, Gar. When you seen the film in the '60s, I'm assuming you'd seen like a midnight showing of something like that, or an evening showing on the TV.
No, it was being shown on TV.
Yeah, TV. Yeah.
And it was, there were so many firsts and everything, that movie is, famous for, historically and culturally, famous for. But I just gravitated towards it because there were so many elements to the story that just, that just pulled you in. Number one, you've got a gigantic ape.
Yeah.
A gigantic ape, not a gorilla, but a gigantic gorilla.
Yeah.
And then you're talking about special effects where when you're watching it at that time, the special effects are very, very believable.
Sure.
And it's so crazy to think that they were able to achieve that, with the hugely limitations with what was available to be able to create all of this back in those days. It's amazing to think how well they did it, and it stood the test of time all the way from 1933 all the way to 1960. And I guarantee you, I'm not the only person in the 1960s that was my age that gravitated towards that. I would imagine there is a huge amount of kids that were my age that were, exposed to King Kong movies at that time and had the same reaction that I was having because it's, when you have it as the only thing, it's huge, it's big, it's very eye-catching, it's very, it just pulls you in. Where nowadays we've had many different versions. The movie started this whole thing about gigantic things, and gigantic things really exploded in the 1960s because now you have Godzilla.
Yeah.
You have all these other gigantic
monster films.
You also have other movies. Attack of the 50-Foot Woman.
Yeah.
That is a famous retro movie from the 1950s. And, so you have all these gigantic, but all of it has King Kong to thank, because King Kong was the first of anything that was gigantic that was used as a vehicle in a movie.
Yeah, you're so right, Gar, about so much of that. I mean, you look at this film that came out in 1933, and it is one of the things it's really known for is the special effects. And we look at it now, and it looks like amateur hour, which it was at the time. But that's why people that are like film historians, they look back on this and they say, for that time of the film era, what they did with King Kong was just amazing. I mean, let's talk about the monkey, the ape. It was so larger than life, as you say. Now, could you imagine back in 1933, being a little kid, had you seen this in the theater, it would have been a much different experience. Because as a child, not only is the ape so much larger than life, but if you were to see it on a big screen, could you just imagine? I mean, the horror that you would have felt in that theater.
Well, and it's really hard for people to get their minds wrapped around it, but I can. When the movie came out in 1933, nothing like that had ever been created before. Mm-hmm. So this child that you're describing going to the theater in 1933 and seeing it had to be like extremely profound and intimidating.
Because you're in the dark, it's all black, it's black and white. The theater is dark. The sound, and it's just amazing. Because, like you said, there have been so many remakes of King Kong, but I dare say the original still is the best for the fact that it is the original, and everything else that's come after is based on the original. And even like later versions that are colorized.
But the point that I'm trying to make is these people in 1933 are seeing it for the first time.
Yeah.
And anything that you experience, you can take just you yourself.
Yeah.
And go back in memory to your first experience of anything. That's happened, that's profound in your life. And that first is huge.
Oh,
you know
sure.
what I mean? It's your reaction to it because you have never seen it before. And you have to kind of put yourself in a position of another person going to the theater in 1933 and seeing something like this for the first time. It is so much bigger, because it is the first time.
And Gar,
it had never been seen before. The human reaction to that, because it's the first time, makes that reaction 10 times bigger than a reaction would be if you've already seen it before.
Oh, sure.
You know what I mean?
And Gar, by the time you'd seen the film, you talk about your experience with King Kong. The film had been out for 30-something years. So as we sit here in 2023 and talk about the film is turning 90 years old this year. So, 9 generations of people have lived through seeing this film. So, and if you go back to our first episode, which was on, Dracula, the very first Dracula movie, that was kind of what started all this, these great Universal horror flicks. And if you even compare the original Dracula film, 1931, to King Kong 2 years later, the Dracula film was very different, and not just the topic, and it focused on a vampire, but the fact, if you go back and watch the original Dracula film, there was very little dialogue, whereas in King Kong there's a lot more dialogue and a lot more special effects, and that's just 2 years after Dracula came out, and you could see all the differences in the way they were making movies just 2 years after Dracula.
Well, the studios discovered that, oh my gosh, if we can do more of this and we can rake in all kinds of bucks, let's do another King Kong. Let's just keep doing a million King Kongs. Yeah. That's kind of the way they look at it, But, it really, it has to do with it. The movie was groundbreaking, and it's really hard for people to get their minds wrapped around that because it's so long ago in 1933. But there's so many things. A movie like that had never been made before. They were using sex sells. Because that movie, a lot of people, when you think back in 1933, it's, much more conservative times and all that stuff. But no, I mean, when I was a young boy, I was very attracted to Fay Wray.
Oh, sure.
And there are nipples,
where
you can see her nipples in the movie. And so it's kind of like, it was really hard for me as a kid to get because I always thought that, they would never allow something like that back in 1933 because the times were so much more conservative. But no, they did sex sells, and they were using that as part of the element in the movie because, there were some scenes in that movie where she was kind of scantily clad, especially for 1933.
And you go back to,
when you think about that, and it was really mind-boggling for me that it was socially acceptable in 1933 for a movie like that with those elements being allowed to be put out there to the masses.
You go. You even.
There were other things that were going on at the same time that signifies that it was so much more. Things like that were just shunned.
Well, another thing, Gar, you go back and you look at the iconic movie poster for King Kong. I mean, they had other ones before that, such as Frankenstein and Dracula and stuff like that. But by the time King Kong comes along in 1933. They really started creating these huge, iconic, movie posters that would really just help to get people to the movie theater. And it's not.
Those posters worked too.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how many times throughout my life that I would go to a movie theater. I'd see like an advertisement, a poster for an upcoming film, and just based on the poster, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, I would go see those films just because the posters were so cool to look at. I mean, very much like back in the day, you'd go buy an album and you just look at the album cover and you like that is so cool. I have to have that,
I gotta see the music's gotta be good too.
Oh, and that's another thing. Now this is another interesting fact, historical quite a bit about what makes King Kong such a historical film. It says King Kong is an American pre-code adventure monster film, which was released on March 7th, 1933. The film's running time is 100 minutes, 104 minutes with the opening overture. Now, like when I was watching the DVD last night, prepping for today's show, there's this thing that says overture, and it's like kind of orchestral music playing at the beginning, as the film is beginning. And why this is so important is it said King Kong was the first feature-length film that ever, and again, this is going back to 1933, to ever feature a musical soundtrack. First feature-length film. So just think about that for a minute, because like I said, films a few years before, like Frankenstein and Dracula, there was very little dialogue in the film, and that's what made this so different. And then you add the music and the different kinds of orchestra music that you hear throughout King Kong. It makes a huge difference if that had not been featured,
Well, all of those decisions were the right decisions, and it just goes back to, yes, that movie, there are so many firsts that movie created that other things followed, and a lot, there's just so many people just do not realize this. Mm-hmm. That is the reason why to date that movie is considered the greatest movie ever made. It's at the top of the list.
In fact, Gar,
a lot of people don't know that. It is at the top of the list because of how profoundly that movie affected the industry.
Oh, yeah.
And created so many changes. That movie is a pivotal point in movie-making history.
Yeah, 90 years later.
There are movies that the way they were made before that movie, and then there are movies the way they were made that were completely differently after King Kong. And that's a slice of movie history that is completely forgotten, and nobody talks about it, and nobody even knows that is what made the movie so profound. It changed the industry.
Yeah, 90 years later, it's a film people still talk about. And, let's talk about the fact that it is black and white. I mean, of course, you watch it today and it looks somewhat dated, but you know what? I love those old classic black and white films. I don't think had this originally been released in color, I don't think it'd have the same effect to be a different film, it'd be probably still...
That's the artistic effect of black and white.
Yeah.
There are so many movies that are better left alone.
Yeah.
And that's one of them.
And now, another thing interesting about King Kong. King Kong was distributed by RKO Radio Pictures, which was a major studio back in the day. In fact, talking a little bit about history here, the studio is no longer in business. King Kong is one of its projects that we're still talking about all these years later. And it said RKO Radio Pictures, who also were responsible for other classics such as Citizen Kane from 1941, It's a Wonderful Life from 1946. We, of course, did a Christmas episode on that a couple years back, and that's a fun episode people can check out. But King Kong comes first, and all these classic films by RKO Pictures were part of Hollywood's golden film era. So again, when we look back on the golden era of Hollywood, King Kong and RKO Picture Studios and all these films they made are part of that golden era.
Well, just think about it. You're like elementary school age, maybe about 4th, 5th grade, or maybe, something like that. That's how old I was, 4th or 5th grade.
Sure, yeah.
And I'm watching this movie, and you're watching the gorilla pick up a log that's got some of the crew members on it, and they're stuck, and he shakes the log, and they fall down down this thing to their death.
Yeah.
And you're watching as a kid, and you're going, I mean, this is trippy because when I'm here I go again doing my Jimmy Stewart. Remember I told you I do that during these interviews? I have this thing where I do, I do the Jimmy Stewart thing, and I'm catching myself.
It's a Wonderful Life, folks, starring Gar Borras.
I had no idea that I do this naturally, but I do it's kind of almost like a stutter kind of thing.
You know what I think it is, Gar? When I talk to you and I notice you do it, when you're getting really passionate about something, so it's all good.
It's an indication that I'm getting really passionate.
It's all good.
You're a kid and you're that young and you're watching it and you're seeing this and you're comparing that to everything else that you've watched, which is mostly cartoons and stuff like that. And now you're watching King Kong and he's shaking this log and all these sailors are falling to their death.
And I imagine
he's fighting like he's fighting Stegosaurus.
Yeah.
It's just all of that stuff is just so bigger than life. And as a kid, 4th, 5th grade, stuff like that is rarely seen. You know what I mean? Not much of it really existed at that time. So now all of a sudden it pops on TV and you're watching it. Of course you're going to be gravitated towards it. It's all bigger than life.
Larger than life,
Dinosaurs, adventure, the jungle, all of these elements that that are the elements of adventure. And so for me, I'm basically describing my childhood experience of gravitating towards adventure movies like that and how entertaining they can be. And that movie was so well done, and it's so well done for 1933, and how it was extremely limited to be able to create that. and yet they did it, and they, I mean, yeah, we look at it nowadays, and it's kind of a joke.
Yeah.
But as a kid back in the 1960s, and you're watching it, it was so lifelike. I bought it like all the way.
Yeah, Gar. Yeah, a couple things to that. I'm so with you. Like when I was watching the film last night, I was keeping it in mind. Like you said, this film is from 1933. But I tell you, I really got myself in the mood. I watched it in the dark, and so like everything's black and white. It's so much kind of larger than life. And I imagine as a little kid, like you said, even though you're aware you're watching a movie, you forget maybe sometimes, hey, this is just a movie, especially as a little kid, and it's so scary. And you got to kind of also think of this, like you said, you sit there and think, hey, I've seen gorillas at the zoo. No gorilla I ever seen is able to do all that. And so you get into that headspace. And we got to also remember, Gar, 1933 was way before even comic books or. Like I don't think Superman was even around till.
I think comics were like in its infancy.
Yeah, but cause I don't think like even Superman or Batman were around till the 1940s. So King Kong kind of predates all that. I remember watching the film last night and seeing very much like you said. At one point, this big huge snake comes and is kind of choking him, but what? Of course, Kong is able to fight it off. He kills the. I love the part where he kills the dinosaur, the T-Rex. And then he's kind of like playing with his mouth opening.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you're talking about. And that little element right there that you talked about made it so lifelike.
Yeah, and you forget as you're watching, especially a little kid, seeing something like that, I bet you would get freaked out. I didn't get freaked out because I'm a grown man, but like I took notice of that as I was watching it last night. And that's the thing, It just, and then there like the scene where he mistakes one woman for Fay Wray's character and throws her kind of to her death, and you're like, wow, this ape is violent.
Well, they when they originally were going to make the movie, they were going to make it a lot darker and a lot scarier. And when I was doing my research for this. They did some test screenings of some of the things that they were wanting to do with the movie that were a lot more hardcore. And when they did the test screenings and people got up and screamed and ran out and they just were not getting the reactions that they wanted, they actually scrapped a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, there were things that they were going to do. Say, for example, there were scenes that they actually cut out from the original. Another one of those firsts is it is the first movie to ever be done as re-released as a remake.
And Gar,
a lot of people don't know that. But when it was re-released as a remake, there were certain scenes that they cut out from the original from 1933 because they felt it was a little too violent, a little too creepy, a little too much for the audience. And one of those scenes that they cut out was where King Kong fights a spider.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing a lot of different versions, but I remember coming across that when I was young and watched this version. I didn't even know. I just watched, here it is. Let's watch it. And I started watching it, and then I caught that spider scene, and I had not seen that in the other versions that I had watched previous to that.
Yeah.
That spider scene is awesome. It is so creepy. I can see why they determined it, as something to cut out because it might be a little too much. But my God, it is a really good scene, and I'm really glad that I got to see that version with the spider scene in it. And
then the funny thing about that is that I read that years later, like when King Kong was first released on DVD, they had added that scene back in, and which is kind of, it makes it kind of a collector's thing because it was censored and cut out for so many years. So people can now go buy the original theatrical version on DVD. Before it was censored, they have like a version with the spider scene, as you say, and I think that's cool. Number one, it makes it a collector's item for people. Number two, I believe that we're all adults and we should be able to censor ourselves. Okay, if you want to watch the DVD of King Kong at home and you don't mind seeing it, the spider scene, that's cool too. But part of this stuff with censoring the film, King Kong was one of the very first films that got censored, and as I was saying at the top of this episode today, that was because it was during what's called the pre-code era. They had all these little things that they would self-censor films with, like you could not have even a woman in a sexy outfit, like even just a silhouette of her show throughout the movie. You could do stuff
which goes back to which I'm sorry if I cut you off.
Go ahead.
Which goes back to what I was actually saying before, where where they were allowing things to stay in the movie that were kind of risque, especially for that time. But yet there censored. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. It's just like, the censors were censoring out certain things that that they were determining that were not acceptable, but they were leaving other things that I'm scratching my head and wait a minute, you're censors and you're allowing this to stay in the movie, which is very risque. And yet you're cutting out things that you feel might be too shocking for the audience.
Yeah.
So that it really shows you how censors have changed over the years at how they operate. In the early years, they were leaving things in that were risque and cutting things out that they felt were too shocking. And eventually it evolved into where they left things in that would be shocking and started censoring out things that were risque. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Those changes in censorship also show a reflection of how time and social attitudes towards those things change over time.
Yeah, and I did a little more reading up on this pre-code stuff, and really looking at it historically. What's interesting is that before there was really even a film standard of what's of what's right and not right, or should be in films. The film companies, the studios, were kind of self-censoring themselves. I mean, you couldn't really think of that. Could you imagine a studio kind of being self-censored, or this is what we're going to leave in or take out? Whereas stuff like King Kong, eventually it caused them to there should be a film industry kind of standard, but even back in 1933, pre-code era, part of that was that you couldn't even have a reference to God or like Jesus Christ. You couldn't even say Jesus Christ or something in a film unless it was in reference to somebody's religion. But just like out of blasphemy, saying "Oh, Jesus Christ" or "God damn," you could not have that in a film.
Well, back in the 60s. You could not say the word pregnant.
Yeah.
On TV or in a movie.
Yeah.
So and it goes back to that. That's those things show you how society's attitudes towards these different things change. You can look at this one decade and socially they looked at those things very negatively, and then you can go to another decade and then socially they find that completely acceptable. And what my point is the social attitudes on things change.
Yeah.
They never stay the same.
Yeah.
And so, and I'm not saying one thing is right or one thing is wrong, but in order for us to stay intelligent, we need to be aware, because I think most people don't even pay attention to that. All they do is pay attention to the here and now and what is this as socially acceptable right now. But you can take what is socially acceptable right now and you can go fast forward 20 years from today, and those things that are socially acceptable now can be completely the opposite.
And
of that attitude. And so which one's right?
And you know, Gar,
that's my question. Which one's right? Nobody can answer that question because those are things that are determined by a society as a group.
like I said, yeah.
Not one person or not one faction, but society as a whole, as a group. And that is a thing to marvel about.
I mean,
because that's something that most people don't think about, that is a huge element of our society. And movies like King Kong, show those shifts. Because when you look at how the movie was released in 1933 versus the attitudes when it became re-released, and then compare that to when it was re-released a second time and re-released as a third time. And each time it was re-released, it reflects, because of how the movie was treated and how the movie was edited and everything, it shows a reflection of what society's attitudes towards those things were at that time. Because each time you take 1932-3, you take 1952, you see what I mean?
Yeah.
All of these different times where they did the re-releases, each time society's attitudes as how they were going to edit that movie reflected that time period.
And you know, Gar, I mean, something as simple as looking at a film from 1933 like King Kong. Let's think about that for a minute, because when King Kong came out in 1933, people from that time period, I imagine a lot of people weren't even thinking about, wouldn't it be neat if we could have, color films. I mean, like you said, when you were a kid, 1960s, that's the first time when, you started seeing colorized TV shows. So going back to 1933, black and white TV, that was a technology back then. And that's why you look at it now, and it does look kind of dated. But could you imagine, even you've lived through it as a little kid, seeing, they're starting to colorize TV shows in the 60s. It's like, wow. I mean, let's even talk about, I mentioned Superman. Superman, I was reading, turns 85 years old, in 2023. And let's talk about that, because, first of all, Superman appears on the radio for the first time back in the 40s. And nobody has to even really think about what does Superman look like. We don't even know because it's on the radio. But then once, Superman starts being in the comic books, now they got to decide, they got to give him a look. They got to start, giving him a personality. And then from the comic books, when they start putting Superman on TV and in the movies, again, advancement, technology, it takes it to the next level,
Yeah, well, you just showed right there, the growth of the industry.
Yeah.
That's basically what you showed. You showed it, where the industry was at that particular time. Because when you bring it up as the listening on the radio, listening to entertainment on the radio in the 1940s was very similar to reading a book.
Yeah.
Or very similar to what people do. Instead of reading the book, now they do these where they listen to somebody reading it to them. You know what I mean? I don't know what that's called, because I don't read books that way.
Yeah.
But the newer generation does not actually sit down with a book and read it. They will put on a recording, and there will be a voice actually reading the story to them.
Oh yeah, I mean,
but what my point is in the 1940s, when you're listening to a radio program, it's very similar to reading the book, because what you're doing when you're reading the book is you're visualizing the entire story in your mind. And that was the beauty of reading a book, is your mind creating how your mind visualizes how this story is being described as you're reading it. And the radio programs were similar to that, because you didn't have anything you were seeing. It was being told to you, and you're visualizing it in your mind. For kids, that's such a fertile ground, which had a lot to do with why kid programs on the radio at that time were very, very popular. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But then eventually, because of comic books, there's the element of color to the pictures.
Sure, sure.
So when the movies and the TV shows started reflecting much more closer to the comic books, then it was a marriage that was perfect. But then you take a thing like King Kong, you can't do it like that.
Yeah.
Because it didn't have those kind of elements. And that is a movie that is better left alone,
Sure.
uncolorized.
Sure.
Because it is so much more effective left as black and white. It just really captures, something that I don't think that they were really intentionally creating this vibe that the movie had, but the vibe that the movie had was an organic thing.
It's just there. It wasn't created.
Never ever created or thought out by anyone. It was just that vibe just happened naturally.
Yeah.
And the black and white part of it is part of that vibe.
And talking a little bit about the vibe, like what I had real fun in watching the film last night is as the beginning credits are rolling, typically it says King Kong stars Fay Wray, Robert Armstrong, and Bruce Cabal. But let's be honest, okay? When anybody thinks of King Kong, the name that immediately comes to mind is Fay Wray. And part of that is, like you said, Gar, sex sells. And that's part of why she was cast in that part, because they thought, okay, a beautiful...
She was pretty hot.
Oh, sure, a beautiful woman, and a very larger-than-life gorilla. And again, you look at that iconic poster. It's not the other stars that are featured on the poster. It's her and King Kong. So that's part of a reason when people think of this film, they think of King Kong and Fay Wray. They don't think necessarily the other actors, and it's nothing against their acting. That's just kind of a vibe of the film. And you got it. And the interesting thing in watching the film last night is instead of saying at the beginning credits like starring, what I found was interesting, it says the players, and then it lists all the actors that are in the film. I thought, okay, maybe that's how they did it back then. They refer to the actors as the players.
It is.
Yeah.
And another thing that was a norm for then that does not exist anymore and has not existed for many, many decades. Back in the 1930s, when a movie was made, they showed the credits at the beginning.
Yeah.
Now, everything, they show the credits at the end.
Yeah.
And so that's just another one of those things that's different from the 1930s to now. And there's a lot more too, but that's just one of the, we don't pay attention to these things.
Sure.
But these are things were done very differently, and the names for what now eventually evolved into calling it the cast.
Sure.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But eventually, before any of that existed, they called it the players, because that all goes back to the entertainment, performance entertainment that was happening before movie pictures was made, which was vaudeville.
Oh, sure. And I thought...
That's what they used as a reference. Those were the players when they were doing vaudeville. They didn't call it the cast when it was vaudeville. They called it the players. Yeah. And as a retro thing, eventually, even though everything had evolved into that being called the cast, there were some people that were still using players as a retro thing, at that time period. So say for example, the not ready for primetime players.
Yeah.
That's what they used. That was the moniker that they used for Saturday Night Live when they first introduced the show to the public way back in the 1970s. That's what they used to call it, the not ready for primetime players.
Yeah, and I just thought it was funny that I immediately picked up on that as the film was starting last night. Now, this is interesting too. We talked a little bit about this was a special film too because of its special effects. Says King Kong is a film that is known for its use of special effects such as stop motion animation, which was an animation filmmaking technique where objects are physically manipulated in small increments between individually photographed frames, so that they will appear to exhibit individual motion or change when the series of film frames is played back.
I got the best way for people to mentally digest what you just said.
Yeah.
Think Gumby and Pokey.
Yeah.
That is the same method when they were making the Gumby, I don't know if you call them cartoons, or animation, that's what you call it, animation. But, they were using the same technique with Gumby and Pokey way back in the 60s, I would imagine, 50s, 60s. And so that's how long that it was introduced by the movie King Kong, but it actually became for all the way from the 1933 all the way up into the 1960s, which would be over 30 years. King Kong created an entire animation industry.
Yeah, which is why if you look at the King Kong in the movie, it's not like any kind of mechanical robot. It's animated. It's like a very early animation. That's why it looks so cartoonish. But that's why King Kong in the 1933 film, if you look at the other background and everything and the other people running around King Kong, that's why it really stands out. It was that early animation.
Well, when they were doing that stop
motion
method of filming animation, when they were doing that, when you're watching the actual final product, which is watching the movie,
stop motion animation,
you can actually see how the animators hand touching the thing and making the different moves and doing all of the different things. It's a flaw in the movie. But you can see how their fingers touching the hairs, would show, that, the hairs, showing a different place. You could actually see it and think of it as a flaw, but it actually created. I just loved, that element to the animation. It just added this weirdness, to it and everything like that. That I don't know. I liked it.
It's called stop motion animation, and besides Gumby and Pokey, that's a great example. Another great example I was reading was. You remember those commercials they used to have back in the 80s, the California raisins? That's another example of that.
Yes, and so that method is still being used today, but nowadays they use it in a retro.
Yeah, and another thing about King Kong that is very looked at historically is the fact that, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the 1933 film Gar, a lot of those scenes, like on the island and the little the different land scenes, those are not actually like real land or anything. They were little scaled down models that they used for their sets.
Yeah, and this is all of that in its infancy, and all of that. There's so many elements to all of that was groundbreaking, but we don't. Most people are not even aware how profound that change. There's another element to the movie that nobody ever really thinks of. That it's another kind of first that was never intended. That's an organic thing from the movie. It's the element of King Kong being the element in the movie that is dangerous and it can cause destruction and death and all of this stuff, but yet the American public loved King Kong and was so sad at the end when King Kong died.
Yeah, yeah.
There was the empathy of the American public towards the bad guy in the movie, which created something that the movie executives discovered and, used that later in life to create other iconic movies where the American public actually embraced the bad guy characters in those movies too. But that, before King Kong, the American public had never done that towards a bad character in the movie. Where all of a sudden, they're sad. They have empathy for that character.
Yeah.
You're supposed to hate that character. He's supposed to be danger. You're supposed to be running away from that character. You're not supposed to be embracing it. That's another thing that happened organically with King Kong that nobody
anticipated,
intended, or even saw.
And Gar, in fact, the thing with that is, if you look at, there's almost two parts to King Kong. There's kind of the build-up before we even see Kong. It's kind of just an average kind of movie, and then all the excitement starts up, of course, once King Kong comes on the screen. And then during the first half of the film, it's like them kind of getting to the island, and they're discovering this monster King Kong. And then once, like you said, towards the middle of the film, when you get to the end of the film, bringing King Kong, to show him off, in New York City, the big display. First of all, that reminded me a lot of the scene in Young Frankenstein where they bring the monster and he's doing his song and dance routine and the public's just loving him. It reminded me very much of that. But then the probably one of the most iconic scenes throughout the whole movie is when King Kong is like on the Empire State Building.
That is pure movie magic.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That you're taking the tallest building in the world at that time, which that building, the Empire State Building, signified the America.
Yeah, Americana.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It really signified. It was the biggest building and the biggest wow of that time. And that's just another thing, because the Empire Building is not considered that now, and nobody has even thought about that for many, many decades. But in the 1930s, that is what that building stood for. It was the tallest building in the world, and it signified a huge amount of pride for the entire United States. And now you're taking that building, you've got a gigantic ape, with Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The sex sells, element of the movie, and he's got her, and he's carrying her as he climbs all the way to the top of the building. And here is that part of that element of the American public, because when he's on top of that building and he's fighting off those planes, and he actually catches one of those planes and throws it down and crashes and kills that pilot and everything, the American public is cheering.
Yeah, in fact, Gar, the only thing that would have been a bigger wow factor is if like King Kong was on the White House or something. But I think choosing the Empire State Building was a great choice because it's in New York City. It's a historical landmark. Everybody knows what it is, not just in New York, the United States, but all around the world. People have heard about the Empire State Building. And I think you're right. For anybody who lived in New York, especially at that time, or even the United States, we all know the Empire State Building, and just the thought that a big giant ape could kind of stand on top of this huge building. I mean, just the horror of that, if it was even feasibly a reality, it is a scary thought. And you're so right. King Kong sets up all these other future, like even the Beauty and the Beast movies, and and stuff like that. would not have even ever came about had King Kong not came first.
Yes, yes. And that ending scene on top of the Empire State Building, I mean, you know, it's looking at it now, it's out of context, but looking at it in 1933, it is such a undescribable wow factor.
And another thing for me in watching the film, I forgot about the fact that King Kong dies at the end. It had been so long since I'd seen the film. And maybe it's because I've seen so many other King Kong films. I mean, for example, the latest one to come out a few years ago was Kong versus Godzilla. And so obviously somehow King Kong has miraculously come back to life. But anyways, even in Kong versus Godzilla, people go anticipating, okay, who's going to win the battle? Is it going to be King Kong or Godzilla? And of course, it's been out a number of years, so I'm not ruining anything. But then by the end of,
to tell you something,
into that film,
I was around at that time,
yeah,
and I was completely drawn into King Kong versus Godzilla.
Yeah.
Nobody rooted for Godzilla.
Yeah.
No one was rooting for Godzilla. Everyone was rooting for King Kong.
Yeah, see,
That's how much the American public loved King Kong back in the 1960s. No one was rooting for Godzilla.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, how old Godzilla is, but I do know it was a Japanese thing that they tried to put into Hollywood.
Godzilla has King Kong to thank. Without King Kong, Godzilla would never exist.
Because I do know for years Godzilla was much more popular in Japan, and a little bit I do know about it after the success of King Kong. The Japanese people thought, okay, we're going to see if we can capitalize and bring Godzilla into the movies. But you're so right. But I was talking specifically about, last couple of years there was a more recent film of Kong versus Godzilla, and very much like you're talking about. Them not anticipating people having empathy for King Kong in the most recent Kong versus Godzilla film. There's the same people going to see the film are kind of having that same anticipation. Who's going to win the battle, Kong or Godzilla? And really, neither one ends up winning, because what ends up happening is Kong and Godzilla end up having empathy for one another, which kind of it's a little different than the original take. But I thought, okay, it's fun, but again, the original, you just can't beat the original.
Well, the American audience was disappointed with that.
Yeah.
Because the American audience wanted King Kong to win. Mm-hmm. And that is the honest to God truth. That when they decided to do that and neither one of them won, the public was disappointed with that decision.
Oh, sure.
And I'm telling you, because I was there, and that's what was being said.
Yeah, and Gar, before you wrap it up today, we talked about some scenes were actually cut from the original film, and these are some of the ones that they censored. Kong undressing Andaro and sniffing his finger. Kong mistakenly grabbing a woman and throwing her to her death. And then the scene with the spider, like you said. So those were the kind of most controversial scenes that they cut out.
Dude, I'm telling you, the spider scene, they should have left that alone, because it is really good. Now, I can see, because 1933, or 1952, because it was creepy. And, I can see why they made that decision, because, there was the element of American society that wasn't ready to see something like that. You know what I mean? It's just so, you just didn't see stuff like that in movies. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so, when you've never seen it before and it just freaks you out, you jump out of your chair and you try to run out of the theater, because, that is the reaction that people were having, with those kind of things. But for me, personally, I love that scene, and it's just a great part of the movie that, it needs to be left in the movie. For me, I do love horror movies, but I just do not gravitate towards
blood and guts.
Violence, blood, guts, and all of that stuff just for blood, guts, and violence. I have to have a good story
to go with it.
You know what I mean? There has to be the elements of a good movie, and it's just that being left in leaves the element of that. It just enhances the movie. It doesn't hurt the movie. It doesn't take away. It actually helps and enhances the movie.
And fun, interesting fact is, years later, I forget what the movie's called. I have to look it up, but I think it was called something like The Spider. There was a horror film, a Universal horror film called The Spider, like these huge giant insects, and very popular back in the day. So again, if it had not been
back in the 1950s and the 1960s, giant things were really popular.
Yeah.
A favorite movie of mine when I was a kid, and it's completely lost now in the scope of movies and everything, but it was really popular back in the 1960s, and I watched this movie and I absolutely loved this movie. It was made back in the 1950s, and it was called Them.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a black and white movie about giant ants.
Yeah, I heard that.
And the premise of the movie was there was a nuclear explosion, and that was the result of radiation on ants. All of a sudden, it created this new breed of ants that's gigantic.
And just the fear factor.
That movie is so good. And that movie was made back in the 1950s. And what does it have the element of? The bad guy or the bad element or the dangerous element of the movie being something that's gigantic.
Oh yeah, sure. Just larger than life. The unknown of the unexpected. But again, Gar, before we wrap up today's show, I like to take a look at what was going on in the world in 1933, and I found some real interesting facts that I thought you would that you have a good laugh at. Okay, January 5th, 1933, Gar, construction of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco began. Again, you and I often can't imagine the world without the Golden Gate Bridge. How many times have you probably driven past it on a vacation or something? But yeah, 1933, they didn't have they just started construction. Can you imagine?
Well, and that bridge is still as solid today as when it was built.
Yeah, and here's a name for you. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the President of the United States, and in 1933 he gave his first address to the nation as president, which became known as his weekly fireside chats. If you know anything about history, those were quite historical because that was the first time ever that people could go to the radio and hear their president on the radio.
It really was a big deal.
Yeah, and it says, in regards to King Kong's legacy, the film has received many honors over the years, starting in 1975 when it was named as one of the best American films by the American Film Institute. So again, all these years later, 90 years later, this film is still being pointed to. Oh, and another thing, it says in 1981, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the video game Donkey Kong was created in 1981. Is very much based on King Kong.
Well, I know that they got sued for doing that, but obviously they didn't win.
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Because it didn't stop them from having the popularity of Donkey Kong, because Donkey Kong at that time was super popular. But you'll never convince me that it's not influenced by Kong, because just the fact that they chose to put Kong in the moniker of it. You know what I mean?
And again,
you know what I mean? They're two separate entities, but King Kong hopefully, the people that get to listen to it, maybe they learn things about the movie. Maybe it inspires them to have a retro night and break out the popcorn and watch a movie that was like truly historically groundbreaking. There's just a million reasons to watch the movie and enjoy it today, and just to think how this movie was created that many years ago.
I mean,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's just mind-boggling. To compare it to everything that exists nowadays, it's kind of a joke.
Yeah.
But to actually look at it and just understand the care and painstaking care that they put into making the movie, because it would never have come out that good had they not taken that kind of care and that kind of thought and that kind of innovation, to put into that movie. It really is a huge pivotal point in movie making.
I mean,
it really is, and I think that's really lost now in the haze of how groundbreaking the movie really was, and how so many other elements of the movie industry today has King Kong to thank.
I mean, Gar,
because their industry would not exist today had it not been for King Kong actually creating their industry.
Let's forget about it being a great horror film or all the other successful horror franchises that came after King Kong. Let's look at the fact for a minute historically, like you said about the stop action motion animation. Had they not discovered that during, used it during King Kong, we might not have ever had any kind of animation or cartoon. So again, another thing to thank King Kong for, and just to show you the beauty of movie making and how how our ears can kind of play tricks on this. I thought you'll get a chuckle out of this when you hear King Kong's roar. Get this, was a lion's roar and a tiger's roar combined, slowed down and ran backwards. So again, we think that's a sound of a gorilla. It's a sound of a tiger and a lion roaring, kind of put together.
And they did the tiger backwards.
Yeah.
And mixed it with the lion forwards.
Yeah, and
that is so trippy. I guarantee you they tried
everything.
So many different variations of that to get to where they came up with that final. But it is perfect.
Yeah, and again,
it is absolutely perfect, and and that's why I keep coming back to painstaking details, because that just right there shows about how much they really put into those little painstaking details.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just that one element alone shows you how much care they put into making that movie. Yeah,
and it said the success of King Kong is what saved RKO Pictures from bankruptcy, and this is, we're going to finally wrap it up for today. It said on August 10th, 2004, 2 days after Fay Ray died, the Empire State Building darkened its lights in her memory. Again, what a huge honor. Only thing I kind of equivalent that to is when Adam West died and the City Hall downtown LA put the bat sign up in his honor.
Well, that's something that is a historic honor to her.
Yeah, sure.
To her herself. And that, that's hugely special, because, when you think about it, no one else can really say, they had
that honor.
That kind of honor.
Yeah.
And it's special because, I mean, really, I don't think that anybody that was behind making the movie ever thought that she was going to wind up becoming the iconic star of the movie.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, when you think about it, the two characters that people only think about is King Kong
and Fay Wray.
And her.
Yeah, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact they were the ones featured on the iconic movie poster that everybody still thinks of all these years later. And Gar Borras, as usual, this was a ton of laughs, ton of fun to do with you. And we get together in 2 weeks, Gar. We're going to have fun looking back on one of my all-time favorite classic TV shows from the 1980s, Family Ties, starring Michael J. Fox. So that will be a lot of fun. So, Gar, if you could hold on for just a quick minute, I'd like to talk to you off air.
Yes!
Okay, bye-bye.
Chaotic Riffs Magazine.